Welcome, everybody. Tonight is the 9th in our series, The Origin Science Scholars, presented to you by the Institute for the Science of Origins, a partnership of Case Western Reserve University, the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, and IdeaStream, with the assistance of the College of Arts and Sciences and the generous support of Richard Morrison. My name is Glenn Starkman, the director of the Institute for the Science of Origin, and it's my pleasure tonight to present to you the third in our three-part series on human origins with Dr. Yohannes Haileselassie, curator of physical anthropology at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History and an ISO fellow. His topic tonight, Ethiopia, the Cradle of Human Origins, New Discoveries from the Field. Dr. Haileselassie.
First, let me give you a highlight of what the contents of my talk are going to be. The first one is the cradles of humankind, because it's not Ethiopia, only Ethiopia who claims to be the cradle of humanity. There's another country who also claims to be the cradle of humankind, and that is South Africa. So I'll talk a little bit about why South Africa claims to be the cradle of humankind, and then I'll follow that up with why Ethiopia claims to be the cradle of humankind. Then, as far as the scientific point of view is concerned, of course, we accept or we agree that Ethiopia is actually the cradle of humanity. But we do have scientific explanations as to why that is the case. And that's what I want to go through by first telling you about the history of paleoanthropological research in this part of the world, what we have done since when, and what we have found in terms of the fossils. And that will be followed by explanations of the geographic location of Ethiopia. Where is it located at? And why is its geography important in terms of being the cradle of humanity? And I'll try to tie that up with plate tectonics, movement of the earth. And the recent hominid fossil finds will be the last part of my talk. I'll start with mentioning Ardi a little bit, but only for 30 seconds, because Dr. Simpson and Dr. Latimer has talked a lot about Ardi. So I don't want to talk about it, which you already know, and you might be tested on that one too, I don't know. But what I'm going to talk about today, particularly in terms of the recent finds, is about Kadanuumuu. Now, by now, you know what specimen Kadanuumuu is, because you have a picture of it on the flyer that you have as a handout. On the back page, you have a photo of a partial skeleton, and that's what Kadanuumuu is. It's a partial skeleton that we announced last June. Kadanuumuu is kind of a long name. It's not as easy as like Lucy or Ardi, so people are having problems actually memorizing or remembering the name Kadanuumuu, but we'll make sure that they remember it in the future. So I'll talk about its discovery. I'll start with its discovery, and also the interpretation, a little bit of the hard science toward the end of my talk. So let's start with the cradle of humankind. Now, this is a logo used by South Africa, and as you can see, Cradle of Humankind is copyrighted, and World Heritage Site is a site that was designated by UNESCO, the United Nations Scientific, Educational, and Cultural Organization, as World Heritage Site in 1999 to refer to an area about 180 square miles wide, about northwest of Johannesburg, which is the capital city of South Africa. And this area has some of the famous cave sites, such as Sterkfontein, where a famous fossil such as the Mist Place were found in. And there are also other cave sites within this 180 square miles area, and UNESCO recognized that as a World Heritage Site. Then South Africa used the Cradle of Humankind to refer to that specific place. And what they've been doing is that using this Cradle of Humanity as the logo for attracting tourists to the country. So it has been a major attraction of tourism in South Africa, and you would wonder why South Africa started claiming to be the cradle of humankind. Obviously, South Africa is the first country to have come up with fossils of early humans early on, before we even started finding fossils in Eastern Africa. The fossils that we have from South Africa were found in the 1920s, 1930s, and then 1940s and 50s, when we only started finding fossils of early humans in Eastern Africa in 1959. So there is a big time lapse between when we started finding fossils in Eastern Africa and South Africa. So South Africa has the right to claim to be the cradle of humankind because they have a long history of these fossils. Now, they take it as far in terms of using this cradle of humankind logo for tourism. They have a beautiful visitor center in the middle of the site, this area of 180 square miles, and that's their visitor center, which I wanted you to show. And then if you look at, just let me go here, if I can play this one, they have a commercial on, which is available online, okay? Now listen to what he is saying.
In southern Africa lie the footprints of the first humans who trod the rich soil of Africa.
The first humans.
It is from here that they ventured out to populate the world, and it is to this place that their distant descendants are returning to explore and experience their origins and to sleep in where their ancestors slept millennia ago. Marubeni, returning to the place of our origins.
Okay, now obviously we know that the first humans didn't set foot in Southern Africa because the earliest or the oldest fossil that we have from South Africa is only 3 million years old, whereas the earliest human ancestors that we have are known from 6 to 7 million years ago. But this just shows you how much this site, World Heritage Site, is being used to attract tourists. But let's look at Ethiopia in terms of how much Cradle of Humanity is being used for touristic purposes. And it's really easy, if you could read what's down here, highlighted in yellow, it is just turning to its prehistoric treasures to use them for tourism. Just beginning. But of course, this beginning was seen when the country decided to send Lucy out to Houston for a big exhibit. And obviously, when they did this, the government was convinced that sending her out to the United States would attract a lot of tourists to Ethiopia. Now, she was not only exhibited in Houston, but she went to Seattle, and then she went to New York, to Times Square. But obviously, the argument is, well, by sending Lucy out to the United States, we're going to attract tourists to Ethiopia. We had problems understanding that logic. But obviously, this is what the minister, of culture said. We're getting a lot of tourists to Ethiopia because Lucy is out in America. Well, I don't know. But anyway, it's not, this Cradle of Humanity idea is not being used as much in Ethiopia for touristic purposes as much as it is used in Southern Africa. But of course, you see some restaurants and, tour agencies using Lucy, Ardi. And I was surprised to find this, Kadanuumuu Tour and Travel. That name is already taken. Somebody copyrighted it. And this, actually, I found this one like a week after the name was announced on, in publication. So people are really, really quick in terms of, grabbing names like this. But the bottom line is Ethiopia is not using the phrase Cradle of Humanity for touristic purposes as much as South Africa is. But scientifically speaking, now let's go back to science. Why is Ethiopia considered as Cradle of Humanity? I'll try to answer this by addressing, one, the paleontological research history in the country, and also what kind of fossil record we have coming out of Ethiopia. And secondly, I'll try to explain the geographic location of the country, why it's important where it is, and also tie that up with plate tectonics. This is all about geology, which I'm not an expert in, but I'll try to summarize it in a very clear form by showing you some slides. Now, let's talk about the paleontological research first. The research efforts in Ethiopia, particularly in paleontology, go back to the 1960s. So because of that, we see numerous paleontological projects conducting research in Ethiopia for the last 5 decades. And because of this continued work, we have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of fossil specimens collected from various sites in Ethiopia. including remains of our early human ancestors. And I want to show you what our human family tree looks like. There are about 22 species on this slide, 22 early human ancestor species. And I haven't even included ourselves in here. Okay, the youngest one that is here on top, right here, is Homo sapiens idaltu, which lived about 160,000 years ago. So these 22 species are fossil forms, and out of this 22 fossil forms, you have about 11 of them found from Ethiopia. Now, it's not just the number, but look also at the time distribution of these hominids. So it covers from all the way from about 6 million years to about recent time. So this is one of the reasons why people, or at least scientists, agree that Ethiopia is actually a cradle of humankind. So just by looking at this evidence, and you ask this question again, why is Ethiopia yielding all this human ancestor fossil species? And a good answer came from one of our colleagues when he was asked the same question. It is a combination of geological accident and the fact that these organisms used to live there at a certain point. So we have a combination of reasons for Ethiopia yielding all this human ancestor fossil species. So that takes us to the geographic location of Ethiopia and plate tectonics. Ethiopia is located in Eastern Africa. We all know that. And this is a very interesting area in terms of, at least geologically, because of plate tectonics. Now, if we zoom into this area here, you see this huge triangular area, which is called the Afar Triangle, okay? And some people refer to that triple junction, Afar triple junction, because this is an area where you have 3 different plates drifting apart from each other, and that's why you have this triangle widening from time to time, and it's still happening. It's been happening for the last 30 million years, and as I said, it's also happening today as we speak. But what is forcing this divergence at this place? And this is something that I got from the web, how it explains the rifting process here. It's literally unstitching itself apart, just like the sleeve of an old shirt. It's really interesting because what's happening, particularly in this area here, is that, as you will see in the next couple of slides, this is getting wider and wider because you have a plate here that's pulling away to the northwest, and you have the Somali plate, which is pulling to the southeast, this one to the northwest, sorry, and you have this one pulling to the north. So you have different plates going in different directions, and you have this triangle being widened from time to time. So here you have what's usually known as the Great East African Rift System, which includes 4 areas. One of them is the Afar Triangle, or the Afar Triple Junction. The second one is the main Ethiopian Rift. It's an extension of the Afar Triangle, as you can see, and it's a northeast southwest trending rift. And then you have the Kenyan Rift, or the Gregory Rift, which goes north-south, sort of dividing Kenya into east and west halves. And finally, you have the Albertine Rift, which is also known as the Western Branch. So these are the ones that add up to make what is called the Great East African Rift System. Now, what's happening here and how these things are formed can actually be shown on simple diagrams like this. And I'll just take you through some of the processes. Here you have the landmass pulling apart in 2 different directions. And as this happens, what's happening is the lithosphere is getting thinner because it's expanding plastically. And what you have here is, because of this rifting, you start seeing this faultings creating high mountains and valleys in between. As you keep going with the rifting process, this gets thinner and thinner, and the hot magma underneath gets a chance to actually come out and erupt in the form of volcanoes. So this process keeps on going as far as these 2 land masses are pulling apart from each other. And what's happening here is that these triangular shapes here are what would be the mountains, and these V-shaped valleys are what would be filled with sediments. And this is also where we get all the lakes formed, a lot of water, and they attract a lot of life. So this is where animals live and die and get fossilized in the long run. So the last part you would see would be all these deposits being accumulated in these basin systems. And what we see in places like Middle Awash is that the thickness of these deposits in some places goes as thick as a kilometer, because this rifting process has been going on for almost 30 million years. But the most active part of this deposition probably took place in the last 7 million years. So if this thing goes on, keeps on, spreading and, pulling apart from each other, we're going to end up having mid-ocean ridges in the middle, okay, and then this landmass gets divided into two different continents. So this is what's happening right now, and of course, what you see in the East African region, particularly in the Afar Rift, is that because of all this pooling, this area here is already thinned. It's very thin crust. In some places, the elevation is 330 feet below sea level. So you already see the process that this is actually thin crust, but today, you go to the Afar region, you see new cracks happening almost every time. You see that one there? I like this one because it shows you how cracks like this exposed old buried deposits. When this gets eroded, you get a chance to look at whatever is inside these horizons that otherwise you wouldn't have any access to. So this is what happened in the past in the Afar region. So this is one of the reasons why the Afar region is a paradise for paleoanthropology and a paradise for geology. But obviously, 10 million years from now, things are going to be different. So the entire East African rift system is going to be probably submerged. And what that means is it might still be a paradise for geologists, but not for paleontologists anymore, because everything would have been buried in the water, as you can see here. So let's talk about when the area is still good for paleontologists. In this area, we see a history of continued research in the last 50 years. The first time that a geologist set foot in this part of the world was in 1969. He was not even a paleontologist, he was a geologist who was studying the history of the Awash River. It's a modern river which starts from up in the highlands and goes across the Rift Valley and drains to Lake Abe, very close to Djibouti. So he wanted to study the history of this river, and that's where he stumbled at Hadar when he saw some fossil bones, and that's how he invited other people like Don Johansen to go do the research. But here we have at least 6 projects that are actively working in the Afar region in this rectangle shown here. And I know that the Middle Awash Research Project is now out in the field looking for fossils. And I will follow soon. In about a month, I'll go to Woranzo Mille and look for more fossils, either relatives of Kadanuumuu or its ancestors or descendants. So this is a very active area in terms of what we do in paleoanthropology. But the 2 specimens that I wanted to highlight as recent finds are Ardi from the Middle Awash Research Project area and Kadanuumuu from the Woranzo Mille Project area. But I mentioned earlier in my first talk that I'm going to pass Ardi just by showing one slide that you see here, just to indicate that she was the top 10 everything of 2009. Scientifically speaking, we've learned a lot from Ardi, which Dr. Latimer and Dr. Simpson have addressed in the last 2 lectures. But just in case it comes on your final exam, 2 points to mention. Ardi told us that chimpanzees are not good models to reconstruct the common ancestor we shared with them. Point 2, Ardi showed us that we did not evolve from a knuckle walker. Those are the 2 points that you should remember. And that's all that I have to say about Ardi. And move on to Kadanuumuu and start with how we found Kadanuumuu. Now, the key question here is, again, one of the questions that was addressed previously by one of you is like, where do you go look for these fossils? And in order to address that question, I included some slides as to how we find places to find fossils from. So we do survey and exploration. And this is one example from my own survey project in 2002. And what we did was we went to this area here, which is probably about 5,000 square kilometers, big area. But we targeted certain areas in this landmass here. And what we did was we did a spot survey. And how do we do the survey? We have various methods that we can do the survey. The first thing is we look at aerial photographs of a specific area that we're interested in. We try to interpret those aerial photographs and try to determine which areas are promising to be sediments with fossils, which areas are just basaltic flows which doesn't have any fossils in them. That's one way to determine first. And then the second thing is, if we have the money, we do air surveys. And when we do air surveys, what we do is we target specific areas where we see sediments. We take GPS coordinates as we fly over them so that we can do the next step, which is the foot and vehicle survey. Now, when we do the foot and vehicle survey, it's not really easy because there are no roads out there. We have to make up our own roads like what you see here. There is a lot of walking, and that's how we find these fossiliferous localities and sites in Eastern Africa. There is no magic to it. In some cases, some explorers go to these places, and they report the presence of fossils in these areas. Somebody goes and checks it out, and sometimes they turn out to be good places, and you find all kinds of fossils. But as a beginner, this is what the steps that you would take. So after our survey, we decided to settle in this rectangular area here, and this is a close-up, because we located some spots with fossils in them. So when we did the initial survey in these areas here, we saw some fossils, and we saw the potential of this place in terms of doing further research in the future. So here is a close-up of the main area that we were really interested in the last 5 years. So whatever you see here as whitish spot is where the sediments are. And this is the area where we have most of the fossils from. And here is the place where we found Kadanuumuu. So stratigraphically, it's very similar to what we have here. This is only about 5 kilometers from here all the way to about here. So you're looking at a large-scale photo. Now, as paleontologists, we don't really do all the work by ourselves. We collect the fossils, but we do need geologists to tell us how old these fossils are. And that's why we always take geologists to the field. And we like sediments that have fossils in them. For geologists, they like this, where they have volcanogenic rocks, interbedded in the sequence. And this is what they're really interested in. This is what they go after, because this is what they sample eventually and give us numbers in terms of how old the fossils we're dealing with. So you see them doing all kinds of things in the field. These are all geologists, some of them sampling rocks, some others trying to look at the stratigraphy and doing measuring sections, some others collecting data for paleomagnetic analysis, and so forth. So it's a multidisciplinary field that we deal with when we look for our earliest ancestors. And these geologists do the geological work, and they give us stratigraphic sections like this with ages of horizons and so forth, and we plug the fossils into these horizons. And here you see signs of bones. These are fossiliferous horizons, so whatever comes from here will have a minimum age at least of this here, 3.77. And sometimes you will find dates like this. Well, you would wonder, why is this older than this one? Isn't the law of superposition tell you that the upper one is younger? But if you look at the margin of error, it's usually within that frame that you have to look at it, because the difference between those two tufts may not be much. It could be within the standard error margin. So sometimes you get this kind of stuff. For geologists, it's very interesting, but for us, we go like, give us the right age so that we can publish our fossils. But geologists do a lot of work. But now let's talk about what we do as paleontologists. Again, this is one of the questions that people usually ask me. whenever I come back from the field, they say, how was the dig? Well, I was not digging, you know. What we do in the field is not digging. What we do is just, you know, walk and walk and walk and walk with our eyes on the ground. Excavation is like 1 in 100 that we do in the field. It's not like archaeology where you may have to do excavation according to your plans. But this is what we do in the field. We look for fossils more or less with our eyes close to the ground. Because what we're looking for are fossils that range in size from what you see here. Now, this might be a little tricky because it's a big screen, but here is a scale. This is a millimeter. From here to here is 1 millimeter. Okay? So you're looking at a mouse jaw. And I have inserted a photo for scale. Now you understand what it is. See that right there? That's the jaw. And here is another mouse jaw on a fingertip. So that's how small some of these specimens are. And it's like, you know, finding, you know, looking for a needle in a haystack. But in some cases, you also find specimens like this one. This is a whole jaw of an elephant. And one of the tooth on one side, for example, this one here is about that long. It's just a single tooth. It's a third molar of an elephant. So in some cases, you'll also find things like this. But the key things that we look for are things like this one. Now, all of us have something like, you know, have something similar to this one. This is one of the molars that we have in our jaws. This is the ultimate goal of what, you know, we do in the field, looking for these things. But where do we find them? We find them in areas where there is a lot of gravel on the ground. And now you can wonder why, you know, we always keep our eyes close to the ground, because finding isolated teeth in this kind of gravelly surface is really very difficult. So usually what we do is we tend to, you know, crawl these areas because as you can see here, thank you. As you can see here, most of these teeth are isolated, and they're very hard to find. Like here you see a fragment of a molar that Alamaya is pointing to, which is highlighted here. But everything else also looks the same in terms of its color. So it's very, very hard work that we do here. And most of the time, we do what you see on this screen, which is crawling. We get on our hands and knees, looking for those isolated teeth, because one teeth means a lot to what we do in terms of our understanding of human origin. So we don't want to miss anything. And in some cases, if you're lucky, you find specimens like this one. This is really a good find. This is half of a jaw of an early human ancestor from 3.7 million years ago. And it feels good when you find things like this, instead of just an isolated fragment of a molar and spend the whole day looking for the other half of that molar. But when you find things like this, obviously you don't pick it up and run away. That's just the beginning. Now, obviously that mandible didn't have the wisdom tooth. It didn't have the front of, you know, the jaw. It must be there. So you start looking around by surface scraping it, by sieving all the dirt that you collect from that area. And if you're lucky, you find the other half in the ground, in situ. This is what you're seeing here. And this is the tooth part on this side. That's the base of the mandible. And this perfectly fits the other jaw. But we didn't have the teeth, so we still have to look for the teeth, because we know since they have fresh breaks, they have to be there. They can't go beyond where we found the mandible. So we look for those, again, by sifting the ground. And then we have to pick up all the sifted material. And if you look at these three screens here, you will see one molar right there, another one here, and either another one right there. So literally, we pick up all the teeth that came off of the mandible. And finally, when you're done with your sieving, you turn a specimen like this to something like this. So now, it started with half a jaw, but now we have the entire mandible, which tells us more about our ancestors better than just half a jaw. But when you talk about partial skeletons like Kadanuumuu, which I'm going to talk about for the rest of my talk, They're very rare in the fossil record. They don't happen that often. And in the last 4 or 5 decades, we have only 5 known partial skeletons. But in the last 20 years, we found at least 2, Ardi and this guy here. And discoveries like this one start with a tiny bit of the skeleton. Like for Ardi, for example, the first piece I found was a hand bone, a little hand bone. That turned out to be a partial skeleton after 3 years of excavation. This one started with an arm bone, which Alamayo is holding here. This is the upper part of the lower arm, okay, which is called the ulna. That was the first piece he found on the ground. And then, of course, we had to surface scrape the area. We found more pieces of not just the ulna, but also other elements. And luckily, before we even started excavating, we exposed one of the hip bones. Now you have an arm bone, you have a hip bone, which tells you that there should be more of that individual at the same site. So that's when you decide right away that you need to excavate. So here you have a formal excavation where we lay grids and we pinpoint every fragment of a bone that we find. That's what you see with these yellow flags. Okay, they show you where specimens have been found. And we did this excavation for 4 years, but most of the specimens came from the 2005-2006 excavation. So here I'm going to show you a few slides with some of the discoveries that were found in situ from the excavation. Here are some ribs. They're very complete, and these are some of the most complete ribs that we have in the Afarensis fossil record. Lucy has a lot of ribs, but most of them are broken, tiny fragments that we can't really say too much about. But these are like complete ribs. We had a complete clavicle, which is the collarbone, which is also the most complete collarbone we have in the fossil record. And we also have what turned out to be a complete shoulder blade, or the scapula, which is also the first complete scapula we have in the fossil record. We found more ribs, and eventually we found the lower leg, the tibia. You can see the whole length of the tibia from here to there. So we have technically most of the body elements from this excavation, and most of this came from the 2005 excavation. Now here you see a bunch of, a pile of rocks, and this is not a cemetery for Kadanuumuu. What we usually do is, when we finish excavation 1 year, and we leave for the next year, we solidify it with rocks so that erosion doesn't take out any bones in our absence. So we cover it with rocks, as you can see here, and then the next year we go, we lift every rock, and we try to reconstruct how we left it last year by putting all the flags back, because we leave pins, we bury pins on wherever there were flags during the excavation, and we reconstruct the whole setting of excavation before we proceed with the excavation. Why do we try to reconstruct the whole image from last year? Because by looking at the distribution of the bones, we can actually follow horizons when we excavate. Which way were they being eroded? It gives us a lot of ideas in terms of which way to proceed in our excavation. So that's why we need all these flags to be put back. So here is after cleaning of the rocks for another year of excavation. But after 2006, regardless of how hard we tried, one, we didn't find any part of the head or the teeth. We only had everything, most of it from below the neck. That was a little bit disappointing, because we're used to naming names based on the teeth and the cranium. So when you don't have that, it becomes a problem to convince your colleagues as to what taxon or what species your specimen belongs to. And I can tell we had some problems with that by assigning Kadanuumuu to Afarensis. So it's not just the excavation. You also have to sieve every dirt pile that came out of the excavation so that you make sure that you didn't miss any bone fragments during the excavation process. So this pile here had to be sieved during the entire field season. So at the end of the 2006, this is the fun part. This is what we had from excavation, surface collection, and so forth. Every piece here that you see has to be joined to some piece in this pile here. So that's like a big jigsaw puzzle. But we had this scapula, the shoulder blade, complete, And we also had the hip bone, which was in a plaster jacket. Everything else was fragmented into what you see here. This is what took me almost 3 years to sit down in laboratories in Addis and in Cleveland in some cases and put it together, as you can see here, all the fragments that I had to play with, and then photo document everything in the process to finally come up with what we have for publication, which is what you see here. So in last June, we did a preliminary publication in the journal PNAS, Proceedings of the National Science, and we assigned the species, this specimen, to Australopithecus afarensis, which is Lucy's species. And of course, the media actually picked it up really well. It was widely talked about for the time being, but our own plain dealer actually had it on the front page, and I was surprised to see this because it has almost all the information that we wanted to convey as a message in our publication. He had its similarities with modern humans and how different it is from chimpanzees. And John Mingles really did a good job on this publication. So he tried to show how different Kadanuumuu was from apes and how similar it was to modern humans. But of course, that's all based on his interviews with me and Dr. Latimer. Nature, which is one of the scientific journals known in the world, called it Africa's next top hominid. That's really cool, isn't it? And Science, which is the other science magazine, calls it Lucy's big brother. Well, Kadanuumuu is about 400,000 years older than Lucy. Lucy is about 3.2 million years old, and Kadanuumuu is about 3.6 million years old. So 400,000 years, big brother, that's okay. But coming to the hard science now, one of the specimens that we have for Kadanuumuu is a complete shoulder blade. Now, why is this so important? First, this is the first complete shoulder blade we have in the fossil record. Now, let me show you something here. You look at this, there are 6 scapula here. This is just a sketch. But here we have 6 scapular fragments, 5 scapular fragments from the fossil record. And we have 1 juvenile here. These are all adults. And if you add all of the 5 adult individuals, that's what they represent, the gray part here. That's all we had known about scapula of early hominids. This one is a juvenile, complete but juvenile, so we can't really use it to infer the morphology of the adult forms. So our discovery of the Kadanuumuu scapula was really interesting because now we can talk about shoulder morphology of early Australopithecus in a much better situation than we did with Lucy's little, scapula here. So what we did was we tried to look at some angular relationships of the scapula. And in the past, people have used this angle, which is called the Barglanoid angle, to infer arboreality in Australopithecus afarensis, particularly based on Lucy's tiny little shoulder blade fragment. But of course, with our specimen, we were able to measure at least 5 angles, most of which were really significant in terms of how we understand the function and morphology of that specific area. So we tried to look at what is called the axillary spine angle. This is the Barglanoid angle, excuse me. And what we find out is that its Barglanoid angle of our specimen is more or less within the ape area as much as Lucy is. Now Lucy is down here, but what you don't see in here is we did not include some of the smaller individuals of modern humans, which actually overlap in their angle with Lucy. A good example would be to show you this one here. This is Lucy's, and this is modern human from a historic collection, from the Lebanon collection. And what you see here is the Barglanoid angle of Lucy is exactly the same as this modern human. So what that means is, functionally speaking, this angle doesn't really tell you much. It's because of the small size of Lucy that looks like it is more arboreal than terrestrial. So our new scapula shows that that angle by itself doesn't really tell you much. But what's really interesting is that there is one angle, okay, the spine axillary angle, which sort of distinguishes humans from apes, clearly, as you can see here. And in that angle, Kadanuumuu also lies within the human range. So that's something that's functionally significant. It tells you the size of the muscles attached on this part of the scapula versus what's attached above it. So the significant angles actually tell you that Kadanuumuu is more like humans than it is like chimpanzees. So these are the kind of angles that we were able to distinguish as significant in taxonomic analysis like what you see here. We also have many ribs remaining from Kadanuumuu, including the second rib. Now, in the past, people have argued that Lucy's species, Australopithecus afarensis, had a chimp-like funnel-shaped rib cage. That's because of the fact that they believe that afarensis was more arboreal, and it should have a rib cage more like a chimpanzee, which are also arboreal. But what we're learning from the second rib of Kadanuumuu is that it's not like a chimpanzee, it's more like a human. And my colleague Dr. Latimer did all the measurements on this, and what he found out is that this is more like modern humans and not like that of a chimpanzee. In addition to what we have from the lower rib cage area, what we can conclude is that Kadanuumuu, in fact, had a more human-like rib cage than a chimpanzee-like rib cage. So that sort of falsifies the hypothesis of funnel-shaped rib cage for early humans in the past. So we have here a specimen that sort of tells us a lot about the morphology of Australopithecus afarensis, particularly its rib cage morphology, its shoulder morphology. And as I said, we've just done the preliminary analysis of this specimen. We still have to do the detailed description of this individual, probably something that's going to come out in a monograph form. But for now, we just wanted to share our preliminary results with the scientific community so that they know what's coming up. So overall, a few things that we can say about Kadanuumuu is that we know that it's 3.6 million years old. And this is based on radiometric dates that we have from below the skeleton site. It is, of course, 400,000 years older than Lucy is, because Lucy is 3.2 million years old. So we have Kadanuumuu 400,000 years older than Lucy. He was about 5 to 5.5 feet tall, and he was a male. How do we know he was a male? One, the large size. It's a very large individual, and that's why we called him Kadanuumuu, which in the Afar language means big man. Kadanuumuu is like a two-word, Kada and Numu. Kada means big, Numu means man in the Afar language where it was found. So Kadanuumuu was a male, but not only from his large size, but we can also tell that from the shape of his pelvis. So the combination of his large size and the pelvic morphology tells you that he was a male, which makes him the first male individual of that species known from the fossil record. Now, in terms of the morphological features of each individual elements of the skeleton, we see that Kadanuumuu is very similar to Lucy. The only difference, well, two differences. One, Lucy is a female and Kadanuumuu is a male. And secondly, Lucy is very tiny. She's a very small individual, unusual for the species. And the fact that she's really small has given us the wrong message in the past. We thought that early human ancestors were small in size. But now what we're learning is that as we increase the sample size, what we're learning is there are individuals as tall as 5.5 feet tall, and 5'2", 5'3", they're very common. So Lucy was unusually very small for the species Australopithecus afarensis. Otherwise, not including the size and the sex, the morphology of Kadanuumuu is very similar to Lucy. And that's one of the reasons why we included it into the species Australopithecus afarensis. Now, that didn't come without critics. Some of our colleagues said, well, you don't have teeth, you don't have, a cranium. How can you put it into afarensis? One of their arguments is because usually we're used to assigning species names based on teeth and the head, morphology of the head. We never assign postcranial elements to a species like really easily, unless they're really associated with craniodental specimens. So we could say, well, that's the only species we have available from that time frame. But they would argue that there is a species named from that time frame known as Kenanthropus platyops. It is a species based on a crushed cranium that was found in Kenya, but some people named a new species to distinguish it from Australopithecus afarensis. But we don't have any postcranial elements of that species. All we have for that species is that crushed cranium. So one of our critics argued, it could be Kenanthropus platyops. Now, our reply to that was that, well, we don't have any postcranial remains for, Kenanthropus platyops. All we have good evidence of is for Australopithecus afarensis. And we know that the similarities between Kadanuumuu and Lucy are very much that they really warrant its assignment to Australopithecus afarensis. We can't really have a specimen like this and leave it out there without a taxonomic designation, particularly when you have all the evidence to show that it is indeed part of the Australopithecus afarensis hypotype. So it would have been better to find the head and the teeth, but with what we have, I think we're good enough to assign it to the species Australopithecus afarensis. Now, other important points that we would like to make about Kadanuumuu is that he had long legs because we have the complete tibia, the lower leg, the shin bone, and we also have part of the thigh bone, the lower part of the thigh bone. And these are really long. They're not short as in chimpanzees. So elongation of the lower legs has already taken place at 3.6 million years ago. Now, in the past, we thought that elongation of our legs came later in our evolution, at least by 2.5 million years ago. Because at 2.5 million years ago, we have some evidence of elongation of the lower legs based on a species known as Australopithecus garhi. At 2.5, that specimen, at least garhi's postcranial elements, show that the lower legs were elongated. But that species also had longer arms, which is a primitive character. So it was not a combination of shortening the arms and elongating the lower legs, but as a sign of being more human-like, we see this elongation of the legs as early as 3.6 million years ago. What's really interesting in relation to this is that this guy is from about 3.6 million years ago, and in the past we had footprints from a site called Laitoli in Tanzania, footprints showing bipedal locomotion dated to about 3.6 million years ago. Now, we had the footprints, but we didn't have the physical evidence. We didn't have any skeletons or foot bones from 3.6 million years ago to show that these footprints were actually made by a human ancestor. Now we have this from Ethiopia at 3.6, which could be like the very species or population which made the Laitoli footprints about the same time. So we have now the physical evidence and also the footprints that are still present in, I hope, in Tanzania. So we had our long legs evolved long before we thought they did. And the other importance is that Australopithecus afarensis thorax was not funnel-shaped. This is important because it makes a whole lot of difference. It tells you about the morphology of the shoulder girdle and the associated anatomy of the thorax. It was never like a chimpanzee. It was more like barrel-shaped, like what we have in modern humans. So these are some of the points that we can actually highlight based on the preliminary analysis that we did on Kadanuumuu. So finally, I'll just show you this slide. And these are 4 partial skeletons that we have from Ethiopia. The first one to be found is Lucy, 1974 by Donald Johansen. And just to remind you, Don Johansen was the curator of physical anthropology at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. And then after that, we have the discovery of Selam in 2000. An Ethiopian guy by the name Zersan Alam Saget found partial skeleton of a juvenile individual from Dikika in Ethiopia. He is currently a director of physical anthropology at Cal Academy of Sciences, and that is about 3.3 million years old. But it is a juvenile. I showed you the shoulder blade of this individual on one of my slides, and we're expecting to learn a lot from Selam in terms of the growth and development of Australopithecus afarensis. So it's a very important specimen, but unfortunately, most of the post-cranial elements are encrusted in very hard matrix. So it's already taken 10 years to clear it off of this matrix, but they're still working on that. But once they're done and do the analysis, we expect to learn a lot about afarensis growth and development from this individual. Then the next one is Ardi, 1994, although she was published in 2009. Ardi has actually told us a lot about what we didn't know about our own evolution. She's told us things that we never expected to know or we never expected to see in the fossil record. This is an individual that has a mix of human-like and chimp-like characters, or ape-like, I would say. It had a foot that has opposable toe, an arm very long like apes, but the pelvis was a mix of characters, some of which tells you that it could walk on two legs, one on the ground, but some of it shows you that it could also climb up trees. Obviously, the morphology of the pelvis added to her feet clearly tells you that she was a good or an able climber if she had to climb up on trees. And this is something that we never expected to find in the fossil record. Because one of the arguments is, do you really find transitional forms in the fossil record? Would you actually recognize those transitional forms in the fossil record if you did find them? And this was exactly what happened with Ardi. Yes, we could. This was a transitional animal who was caught in transition from a quadruped biped into entirely biped gait through time. So here we have a number of specimens from Ethiopia, and I'm just going to go back to my first question. Why do we say Ethiopia is the cradle of humanity? Well, here is the evidence. We have most of the complete specimens of early human ancestors, and we have fossils that sample the last 6 million years of our evolutionary history. And we're going to probably keep finding more of these specimens as we keep continuing the field work in the near future. Thank you very much.